Next thing we are going to cover are the nested routes. Now, any nested files inside the pages folder are essentially nested routes. Now, in our app Coffee Connoisseur, whenever we click on any of the listed coffee shops, notice how the URL changes to /coffee store. Now let's click on Bluestone Lane, as that's one of my favorite coffee shops. Once we click, notice how the URL changes to /coffee store / some uniquely generated ID. Now this ID is essentially uniquely generated to identify this coffee store, and we will take a look at this ID later in the course. But a nested route is essentially anything after the /, the first /. So coffee store is a nested route of the root route, and this specific ID is a nested route of coffee store. Now let's go ahead and create that nested route coffee store. In our VS Code, under the pages directory, since Next.js uses a file-based routing system, remember we need to create a file called as coffee store since we want to create a route /coffee store. Now right here, let's create coffeestore.js. Alright, and now let's go ahead and create a simple React component. Now in order for Next.js to recognize this as a valid route, remember we need to do two things. We need to make sure that the page needs to be a React component. And second, the component needs to be exported by default. So let's do that. Right here, let's create a component called coffee store. And in this component, let's make sure to return a simple text like coffee store page, because this is coffee store page. And let's export it by default as the second rule of creating a route. All right, now that we have done that, let's go ahead to the browser and try it out. Right here, let's say coffee store. Whoops, the page cannot be found, and it is coffee-store. So one thing to note right here is that anytime we create or we try to access something that doesn't necessarily exist in our pages directory, that Next.js file system cannot necessarily discover or can find it, then it's automatically going to return a 404 page. That is page not found page. And it automatically does that, so we don't need to set up anything for that. So this, which is pretty neat because this is an additional feature that Next.js provides. All right, so now let's go ahead and check why we can't route to coffee store. Over here, we have called this as a coffee store component. We have exported. And look at that. I made a mistake while typing, and it should be coffee store, right? So now if I go ahead and try it out again. Sweet, look at that. Coffee store page has been rendered automatically. But wait, hold on a second. Don't we want the route to be dynamic? Well, it's not just coffee store. There's also some ID after. So if I go back and click on grep, notice how the ID is different right here. So this ID keeps changing. So how do we create something this dynamic? Well, that brings us to the third type of routing in Next.js, which is the dynamic routes. Now let's explore that in the next lesson.